joint statement released by Finland, European leaders, including those from Britain, France, Germany, and Ukraine, have reaffirmed their strong support for U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts to end the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. The leaders called for an immediate halt with the current line of contact, serving as the starting point for negotiations. They've also emphasized the need to increase pressure on Russia's economy and defense industry until President Putin is prepared to make peace. An important summit will take place later this week in the European Council and Coalition of the Willing formats to discuss further steps into the ongoing crisis. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Dan Perry. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Dan, for staying with us. Now, how effective is these continuous sanctions and economic and defense pressure to counter or compel Russia to negotiate peace?
I haven't observed that they are very effective at all, for the simple reason that, well, for a number of not so simple reasons. One is that the economic stranglehold that was threatened against Russia from the beginning, from February 2022, has simply not been total. The Russian banking system has not been totally thrown out of SWIFT. Russia continues to be allowed to export oil and gas, less than before, under price caps, yes, but they continue to be able to do it. And even a major Western ally, which is India, have been more or less allowed by the Biden administration to buy significant amounts of oil from Russia, to the point where the proportion of Russian oil that constitutes the oil imports of India is now like many times larger than it was before. And of course, they have markets in the Far East and China. Moreover, Putin has essentially rebuilt his economy to be a war economy that is prepared to withstand the impact of the war for many years going forward. And the nature of his kleptocracy is such that he has been able to buy the loyalty of his entire coterie of military, well, much of his coterie of military and political adjutants. So they may be able to survive unless the West really takes significant action of a nature that would involve also a great disruption of global oil markets and in general global markets. That would involve the West being able to absorb some pain. They haven't really shown that. This statement coming out of Finland seems like a step forward, but in a way it reflects what I believe was at least the unspoken European consensus or Western consensus for a while, which is that the war should freeze at the current lines and negotiations should begin. And then the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean Ukraine has agreed essentially to give up 85 to 90% of the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, and other bits of Ukraine, including Crimea? Ukraine is essentially not currently in control of about 20% of its territory. If we freeze the lines where we currently are, which is what this statement out of Finland says, well, does that mean Ukraine agrees that those territories, which are essentially annexed by Russia by now, remain with Russia? They're going to say no, but the music says yes, basically. And that is doubly so when we see that Donald Trump has essentially told Zelenskyy that you have to basically forget about those territories. The major frustration on the part of the Europeans, is that Donald Trump's position is completely unpredictable and inconsistent. One day he says Ukraine can recover all its territory. The next day, after talking to Putin, he again is screaming at Zelenskyy to give up the territory. One day he's going to give Ukraine tomahawks, the next day he's not. It clearly looks like Trump is a non-dependable ally in this regard, and that may be hastening Europe's understanding as well that the war really needs to come to an end because the U.S. is basically not to be dependent on.
And then lastly, I also wanted to ask your opinion on, how we see these news coming in from Europe about the location if a trilateral or bilateral summit between Putin and Trump or Putin, Trump and Zelenskyy were to happen. Some countries in Europe have, of course, been appalled by this idea, and then some have said that this is a step that we must take. to end the war. What do you think about the location?
Well, Putin is a wanted war criminal, and wherever he goes in Europe, more or less, he needs to be arrested. That is why the previous summit occurred in Alaska. There are ways around this, you know. The ICC's arrest warrant against Putin can be suspended with not amnesty, but I believe it's called, I forget the name of the clause, but there's a clause in the ICC treaty that enables them to essentially give a foreign leader who's under an arrest warrant a pass, and it can be temporary. So there are ways to get around it. I think it's called Section 8. And indeed, many of Europe's countries have done that for Benjamin Netanyahu at U.S. request. Now, this is an important precedent because the Trump administration demanded of European countries, one after the other, not just Hungary, that they allow Netanyahu this reprieve, even as he flies over their territory, for example, en route to the U.S. Trump can obviously do the same for Putin. It will not be popular, but if it is married to some notion that Putin is easing his position and prepared to compromise, and maybe prepared to forswear, for example, any and all claims to Ukraine beyond the 20% that he holds, there will be tremendous pressure, I suspect also from public opinion, that whatever country hosts the summit and in general, that Europe as a whole just do what it can to end the war. The big, enormous question is if Putin is allowed to hold on to 20% of Ukraine as a consequence of Russia's naked and clearly illegal aggression that has no justification conceivable, does that reward such aggression in a way that encourages repeat cases? And what can Europe, for example, do to avoid that narrative from settling in that Putin won the war? And to my mind, since I do believe NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table, and indeed NATO membership for Ukraine isn't as important as it seems, because you can be defended under something similar to Article 5 of NATO, even without being a member of NATO, as indeed Ukraine has been defended. The main thing Europe can do is to fast-track EU membership for Ukraine. And I believe this is actually the more important. Ukraine already has a military that's better than any in Europe. What Ukraine needs is stability, regional institutional guarantees, and the prosperity that will come from membership in the European Union, and that needs to be at a minimum the reward for, 3.5 years of basically standing up for the West in the face of the most naked aggression.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us and sharing that insight throughout our news. That was Dan Perry. He's a political analyst, joined us live from Tel Aviv. Now we move on to our next news. China has responded to a critical minerals agreement signed between the US and Australia. The deal is aimed at reducing Beijing's dominance over essential resources. China's foreign ministry spokesperson has emphasized that global supply chains should be driven by market forces and not geopolitical maneuvering. Beijing has also voiced opposition to the trilateral AUKUS pact involving the US, UK, and Australia, which focuses on nuclear submarine cooperation and advanced military technology. This response follows the announcement that the US and Australia will invest billions to support mineral projects aiming to weaken China's grip on critical supplies used in clean energy and military technology.
全球产供链的形成是市场和企业选择的结果。关键矿产资源国应为保障产业链、供应链的安全稳定发挥积极作用，确保正常的经贸合作。中方已多次就美英澳建立所谓三方安全伙伴